Hello everyone, this is CounterYolo, bringing you another video in Star Trek Online. And yeah, it has been a little bit, but today we'll be talking about the Tier 6 Voth starships that were just recently announced, with the brand new Infinity box that'll be coming out pretty soon later on this week. In this video, I will, as succinctly as I can, talk about the recent carrier changes that happened inside the game, and I will also just include some of my opinions on slides for y'all to read if you so choose. And then I'll get into the Voth ships themselves. First, the Voth carrier, as well as the Voth science vessel. I'll then conclude with the traits and consoles for those ships, and a TLDW at the end of this video. Feel free to see the time links in the description for those of you that do not desire to see this entire video. I know that a lot of you like to skip around. So, all that said, let's get started. So, recently, last week, towards the beginning of STLV, it was announced on the Art Games website that Flight-Deck Cruisers were going to be getting a significant buff, in that they would now be a bit more competitive versus the Dreadnought Cruisers, which for a long time in Star Trek Online were considered vastly superior to them. Additionally, escort carriers had a name change, and the much more awaited update to Tier 6 temporal ships. Some of the very old initial ones didn't have a Commander Temporal Operative seat. They have recently changed that to 6 particular ships that now have a Commander Temporal Operative seat. The link to this announcement will be in the description. I'll be mainly focusing on the Flight Deck Carrier update, just because that is the most relevant thing to this particular comparisons video. To Flight Deck Cruisers, with the old mentality behind it, as I talked about in my Starship Subclasses Explained video, Flight Deck Carriers were essentially cruisers that lost 2 cruiser commands to get a hangar bay, which kind of sucked to a lot of people because these ships could not use dual cannons and dual heavy cannons, while Dreadnought cruisers had the better cruiser commands to DPS captains, also had a hangar bay, but could still use dual heavy cannons. So Cryptic was like, well, yeah, this kind of sucks, and we agree, this kind of sucks, so let's just update them more. And so let's have them lean more into them being a carrier, since carriers have had a lot of neglect over time in this game. And so, yeah, so basically what they did with these ships instead was they renamed them to Flight Deck Carriers now instead of Flight Deck Cruisers, and they added a hangar bay. And so they still can use dual cannons and dual heavy cannons, but they have 8 weapons and 2 hangar bays. Dreadnought cruisers only have 1 hangar bay with dual heavy cannons. These ships have 2 hangar bays. And whenever you compare that to the other carriers inside the game, with the exception of the 26th Century Promotion starships, all the other carriers that exist inside of the game, if they have access to dual cannons or dual heavy cannons, they do not have a full 8 weapon array of weapons available to them. They have 7 or they have 6. So basically, Flight Deck Carriers now, they're basically if you're someone who's going to be using beam arrays or dual beam banks, their ships, they're probably going to be the best option for you. Only if you're wanting to use dual cannons plus have 2 hangar bays, then you might consider one of the other general types of carriers inside the game. The 3 really outdated engineering carriers they said would not be updated, like the Obelisk carrier, the Voragon carrier, and the Thillinger Grumel, which is really a big downside, frankly, as well as the science carriers. These 2 groups, especially, in my opinion, do need buffs in the future besides the Fleet Carfi. Here are a couple of slides talking a bit more about that, in my opinion. It's totally up to you as to whether you want to look at those slides in greater detail. But the real point of this video is to talk about the Voth starships, so let's get right into that now. The 2 starships that they're adding Tier 6 versions to is the old Voth Bastion and the old Voth Palisade, in which the Voth Bastion is now the Voth Rampart Command Flight Deck Carrier. Again, as I just said earlier, Flight Deck Cruisers are now Flight Deck Carriers, and that they have 2 hangar bays instead of 1. Otherwise, they're basically the same class. The hull and ship ratio is the exact same from it previously. The big thing that you're getting with this new version is that you have a Lieutenant Commander Tactical seat. The old seat here for the Tier 5 version was a Lieutenant Tactical, and you're also getting the 2 seats for the special seating here from the exchange. Other than that, it's basically the same as what it was. It is still a very good, well-rounded cruiser for tanking, and also has 2 hangar bays, so it is a decent carrier as well. even though I'm not a particularly big fan of carriers. For the Voth Bastille, when I saw this, I initially thought it said Bastille, like, you know, Bastille Sean from Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. But anyway, the Voth Bastille temporal science vessel, just like its Tier 5 predecessor, has a very, very strong hull and shield ratio combo, very reminiscent of a certain extremely valuable starship from the C-Store called the Eternal Multi-Mission Science Vessel. Difference being this is just a regular science vessel instead of a multi-mission science vessel. So this ship does not have access to dual cannons, nor does it have access to any hangar base whatsoever, to my understanding anyways. Feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about this. Even with those disadvantages, this ship is still a beast for science tanking. Or at least should be. So let's go ahead and get right into the carrier comparisons, because the Voth Bastion, or our new Tier 6 Voth Bastion, the Voth Rampart. I've said Voth Bastion so much on this channel. Anyway, the new Voth Rampart is a carrier, so we'll be comparing this ship first to other flight deck carriers in the game, and then we'll compare them to the other 3 different variants of carriers inside the game as well. Because I know a lot of you like carriers, and so we'll show you the stats for them. For the Voth Rampart, as you can see here again, it's got a Commander Command Seat, which is great for tanking. Only 3 tablet consoles, so a bit of a downside. Still has access to Command Track Fire. And it has a Commander Tact seat versus the Lieutenant Tactical seat here from the Tier 5U Voth Bastion. Other than that, the stats are virtually the same between the 2 ships. So it is it actually is a pretty substantial upgrade because of that Lieutenant Commander Tactical increase. As I talked about with some of you over the past couple of months, the biggest downside to this ship, the Tier 5U Voth Bastion, was that it was a bit lacking on tactical abilities, just because of how, for a lot of budget builds, you probably should be building your ship. With the Voth Rampart, you don't have that issue anymore. But of course, it's a Tier 6 ship, so it's still going to run a couple million in energy credits, or a couple 100 million energy credits on the exchange. So it's no longer going to be a budget ship anymore, because this is going to be more exclusive. It also means the Voth Bastion is going to start rising drastically in price over the next few days. In terms of stuff from the C-Store and the fleet, here are the ones that I consider to be the best ones overall. The Bastion Flight-Deck carrier is the only one from the C-Store. Anyway, you don't have a Lieutenant Commander Science, so no gravity well, but because you have an intelligence seat, you do have access to ionic turbulence, which is a good replacement for gravity well on ships that cannot, or it's hard to afford to put in a Lieutenant Commander Science for a gravity well for controlling people and keeping them in a certain arc for your build. The Fleet Sub 1 Silic, in my opinion, is still going to be the best cruiser tank available from your fleet. The Fleet Turret Perlum and the Fleet Orion Blackguard are still great non-Romulan equivalents to this thing. The downside to those ships is that you don't get a battle cloak, but if you don't care about a battle cloak whatsoever in Star Trek Online, the other ships are better because they have a higher hull ratio to compensate for not having a battle cloak on those starships. But anyway, both of these ships here have a 5.3 weapon layout instead of a 4.4. And with the Voth ship, you basically have to broadside. With these 2 ships, you could do a 5.3 dual beam bank build on these ships. When we're talking about the exchange, there's only 2 other real ships available in this subclass at all. The Herald Quas Flight Deck Carrier. It's got excellent stats in its hull and shield ratio, both at 1.3 or higher, but you're stuck with broadsiding. You don't have a Commander Engineering Specialist seat on it, which from the exchange nowadays kind of sucks, to be honest, and nothing super impactful on this ship overall. And of course, we have the Discovery Enterprise as well. There's also the Discovery D7, but I don't think it's quite as valuable, just because the Discovery Enterprise, you do have advanced phaser beam arrays available to you, which are the best phaser beam arrays in the game right now that you can get with this ship. With Klingons, especially if you're going to go disruptors, you do have spiral disruptors available from the C-Store that you can get if you just buy one of the Cardassian starships from the C store. I think for some people they've said that it's bugged and that you have to get the full Cardassian 4-ship pack in order to get it unlocked. For some people they've said that only one starship is fine. I'm not fully sure, honestly. I got the Gemini Vanguard big pack when I was getting it for both of my accounts, so when I bought the big pack, I got access to Sprout Disruptors for all of my characters easily. But anyway, this is a flight deck carrier that is extremely good. I think it's cool that they made it a carrier because it was released with 2 hangar bays. It is a Miracle Worker starship, so it's going to be a little bit superior. Whether it's worth the billion energy credit cost is up to you personally. As for the ships that in the billion credit category that I consider a little bit better are the 26th century promo carriers. They aren't technically called carriers, but they basically are. And they're basically the flight deck carriers, except they have better stats, better base stats anyway, for terrible turning and inertia. And they have access to dual cannons and dual heavy cannons. Plus they have access to a lance. So if you're okay and are willing to spend a lot more money on it, these ships are a pretty decent alternative for a carrier to play inside of the game. In Alpha Squadron Elite, the fleet and armada that I am a part of right now, we are starting up a cruiser group pretty soon. And so a lot of the ships in this video, this early part of this video, you can feel free to use for that particular group. There are a couple of other carriers here, but I don't feel like they're as good in my opinion. The Valkyrie Hydronaut carrier is basically an engineering carrier that loses 1 weapon to get access to dual cannons. Up to you as whether that's worth it. The Thorian Grumo, some people call it a science vessel, but with its high base stats and the fact that the Admin system calls it an engineering vessel, I personally consider it an engineering vessel. It's totally up to you whether you want to consider it a science vessel or not. It's got a command and universal miracle worker, so you can basically make whatever type of vessel that you wish to make it. For tactical carriers, the Zenkethi Dreadnought carrier is the best one. It's also one of the best platforms for torpedo builds inside of the game as well. It's also in that billion credit category though, so it's out of the price range of most people inside of the game. The Gemini Dreadnought carrier I just have here because bringing out Gemini strike ships out of your hangar bay is pretty cool to see in my opinion. That's why I like to fly from time to time. For science carriers, the Karfi in my opinion is the best one. It's got 7 weapons, unlike all the other science carriers that only have 6. If only this ship actually had a tier 6 version. Cryptic, if you're listening, please add a tier 6 version ASAP. That would be very much appreciated. That would help also boost extra people playing the KDF faction. Gemini Vanguard carrier is considered one of the best ones available from the C store. Very nice base stats. You've only 6 weapons, but you do at least have the Vanguard Wingman mechanic to help out with the fact that you only have 6 weapons. Okay, with that all said, let's go ahead and get into these science vessels comparisons. Talking about the tier 6 version of the old Voth Palisade science vessel. And this is a vessel that for a tier 5 ship was extremely well rounded. It only had 4 seats instead of 5, and so with the new version, they added an ensign tactical seat to this, and made 2 of the seats have specialist seating. So the biggest boost for the tier 6 version actually is the commander science temporal operative stuff to it. It's not actually the bridge after seating itself. The raw bridge after seating additions is what's making this different. It's that temporal operative seat to this. Combined with the other survivability stuff that exists for Voth ships, this is a beast science ship nowadays. Now, whenever you compare this versus fleet stuff really is no contest. This thing is going to be better. A little bit slower, but a very, very strong ship. Leonados is still one of the standard DPS science vessels available inside the game. Also very fast considering all of that. Both these ships are only available to Federation. You can feel free to watch my best earnable tank video if you want to see some science vessels that I recommend. if you extend to the C-Store, this is where you start to see some interesting comparisons. The Voth Bastille cannot use dual cannons, so that is a downside versus these other multi-mission vessels inside the game, which are some of the more well-rounded starships inside of the game. If you actually look at the base stats of the Voth Bastille versus the Eternal Science vessel, a lot of this stuff is eerily similar. Slightly lower turn rate, hull and shields are practically the same. Bridge after seating is also extremely similar. This ship has 2 universal seats. This one's an attack with improper finance and science, and it's a tactical lieutenant commander, or the lieutenant command. Other than that, pretty much the same, frankly, between the Eternal and the Voth Bastille. With the access to the Voth Bulwark console, if you happen to have that in conjunction with this ship, I would say the Bastille is actually the strongest science tank inside the game. However, if you're going from a effective for your money, especially if you have multiple characters doing science tanking, I would lean towards the Eternal just because you buy the 31st Century Tempership bundle once, and then you have 3 starships available to all of your characters, including the really strong consoles that are on them. So, really is up to you. If this is your thing, especially if you want to use the 3 console bonus to get a Voth Battle Cloak on this ship, you definitely can. As for more ships from the exchange, the Untitled Chapter is a pretty standard one that has a lot of bans in PvP, especially its console, the time slip ability that's available to this ship. Very strong and fast ship with a battle cloak, dual heavy cannons. A little bit lower hull, but it's a really fast ship, so it doesn't quite affect it as much. The Crossfield is still one of the most well-rounded science ships inside the game, frankly. Really high hull ratio, which is unusual for a science ship, especially with a science ship with this much turning and impulse, plus a respectable shield ratio, still considering all of that. No special seating for either of these ships, but a lot of the other special stuff with these ships kind of carry them a little bit more than what you would traditionally expect. They aren't going to be the best DPS ships, but they are still very respectable ships. Okay, so let's conclude with consoles and traits, and then let's do the TLDW after that. So starting off with the Tier 6 version of the Voth Bastion. The Voth Rampart starship trait is called Voth Carrier Synergies. With this trait, when you activate engineering abilities, it increases incoming healing to yourself, which is great for tanks, as well as it grants your pets that you send out temporary immunity to energy damage. Not immunity to, let's say, starships exploding or physical damage or radiation damage, but just to energy damage. In terms of this trait of whether it's good, it is definitely going to be good for carrier type builds. It might also be good for tanks. It depends upon how good that incoming healing bonus actually is. If it's not that much and the emphasis is on the pet immunity, I'm probably going to be ignoring the trait altogether. I'm still going to be buying the Voth Rampart because I've got one character that is themed around being Voth. But other than that character, I'm probably not going to buy this ship multiple times. The console, enhanced reflective matrix, unless they are increasing the threshold for how much damage you receive before your temporary immunity goes away, this isn't particularly a great console for advanced or elite content. If you're buying one ship and all you want to do is play normal content, it's still a very strong single console, which is also why I loved in my budget tank videos of having the Voth Bastion in there, just because it was a strong clicky console that worked for budget builds, frankly. And now it's going to be going out of the budget build realm, just like the Tier 5 Tholian science ship went out of the budget realm. When it comes to the Voth Bastille, its starship trait is rapid response shielding. Upon decloaking or upon using emergency power to shields, you get a boost to particle generator, drain, and shield capacity. Shield capacity doesn't really matter, frankly, but the boost to particle generator and to drain might be interesting, especially for science tanks. Having emergency power to shields actually be a potential viable damage boost for exotic builds could be quite interesting. Again, we'll have to see on the stats to see if this actually is the case. But again, for both of these ships, the consoles cannot be used on ships other than Voth starships. So keep that in mind. If you're buying these ships and do not plan to fly them, it's mainly just going to be for the starship traits, as to whether you're actually going to be wanting to buy the ships or not. The enhanced asset mode is actually kind of decent for a science ship, especially a science ship that is a tanking science ship. The passive boost of drain and shield capacity, we'll see how good that is. The clicky was always okay. It wasn't always spectacular, but it was always okay. If you have a drain tank build, for a Voth Bastille build, I could definitely see this being workable. The reason why Voth ships have always been respectable and really good have been because of the war repair ship from the Tier 5 Voth Bulwark Dreadnought Cruiser. So I have a snapshot here of what this console does. Essentially, this is a self-res that you can click after you blow up, or after you go to 0 hit points. And after you click this, you go to full health, full hull, full shields, all your power levels immediately go up to 100. And if your power levels are higher than that, then they can start going higher than that as well after this. As well as your shield resistance is immediately boosted to 75% shield resistance, which is a very, very big deal. There are not very many consoles in the game that can give you 75% shield resistance, so that is really, really powerful. Because of that, as a standalone console for Voth ships inside the game, this alone is extremely strong. It's not available from either of the ships mentioned in this post that was released. The original place where the Voth Bulwark was released was in an old promotion pack, which no longer exists because your promotion packs starships now are all Tier 6 starships. It's why the ship was added as an ultra rare token to the Phoenix prize pack, which is also why if you happen to have an ultra rare token, the Voth Bulwark is the most valuable Tier 5 ship in there. Unfortunately, just like the other Voth consoles, this console can only be used on Voth starships, so only Voth starships can really capitalize on this console. When Cryptic eventually gives us a Tier 6 Voth Bulwark, it'll be interesting to see if they keep the restriction of this console to Voth ships, or if they decide to actually let other ships be able to use this console. Because frankly, in my opinion, if they didn't change anything on Voth Bulwark besides add one bridge officer ability and just made the war repair ship available to be used on any starship in the game, that would probably be a big enough boost to have people still buy that from your promotion packs. But that's just my opinion. The reason why you would want all three of the Voth consoles on a single ship is so that you can get the Voth Battle Cloak. The Voth Cloak is basically just a cloak because, like any other standard cloak, you can't use it during combat. So the big strong thing for Voth Cloaks is that you get additional damage resistance rating whenever you're going into and out of the cloak. Plus more defense like any other cloak does too, but and a damage boost like regular cloaks out there. However, you only get that capitalization bonus, be able to see that in action, if you have the full 3-piece Voth Battle Cloak, in which you can actually, cloak during combat, and you have less of a worry about dying if you need to go into or out of the cloak. Going into the cloak maybe to get a little respite from the fight, or going into and immediately back out of the cloak because you're a Romulan and can do that really quickly. Whatever your playstyle, at least playstyle when it comes to cloaks, having a 3-piece set bonus is nice. You are going to be losing a console slot or two worth of stuff to be able to use the Battle Cloak, unfortunately, so it's going to be up to you if buying those ships is worth it for that. But still, regardless of all that, these ships are still very strong considering all that. So, for the TLDW for this video, Flight-Deck Cruisers recently got a change. They're going to be called Flight-Deck Carriers now, and then they have 2 hangar bays instead of 1 like they used to. That's why they're called Flight-Deck Carriers now. The Voth Rampart carrier is the tier 6 version of the old Voth Bastion Cruiser. It is a very solid tanking cruiser / carrier. If you already have lots of other cruisers inside the game and are going for a tanking type build, this ship is only really better than a lot of those if you happen to have the Bulwark self-res console available to your character that you're going to be using the ship on. Otherwise, there are a lot of other ships that are going to be more competitive than this one, but still, it is a flight deck carrier. It's got 2 hangar bays with 8 weapons, so that's something nice. The Voth Bastille science vessel, in my opinion, for science tanking, if again, if you have the Bulwark self-res console, it is a smidget better than the Eternal multi-mission science vessel from the C-Store for science tanking. In that new circumstance, the Voth Bastille is better. In most other circumstances, the Eternal probably is still going to beat out the Voth Bastille, sadly. There have just been so many ships as well released over the past year that a lot of ships are kind of left in the dust. With that being said, the Voth carrier trait is interesting. Whenever you activate engineering abilities, you get some sort of percentage increase to heals to yourself, whether it's from you or from others, which is great for tanks, as well as whenever you activate those engineering abilities again, pets become temporarily invulnerable from energy damage for a few seconds, which is definitely going to be valuable for carrier-oriented builds. Potentially for tanks as well. I'm really going to have to look at the stats and compare them versus other things to see if it's actually going to be really worthwhile. It probably won't be, but maybe in happenstance it might be. For the Voth science trait, it activates whenever you decloak or whenever you use emergency power to shields. When you do either of those two things, you get a boost to your particle generator skill, your drain skill, and an increase to your shield capacity for a few seconds. This is actually the more interesting of the two, in my opinion, because especially for science tanks, it's going to be interesting to see how good the stats are, because potentially constantly spamming an ability that's meant for survival to help increase your damage could be quite interesting. It could be very, very interesting. Again, we'll have to see on the stats as to whether it's really, really good or not. For the Voth consoles themselves, just as a reminder, for all Voth consoles from these ships, they're only usable on Voth starships. The Voth Bulwark console that I also mentioned in this video is also only able to be used on Voth starships. You do not need to buy all these starships unless you intend to actually run a Voth battlecloak on one of these starships. In most cases, it's not going to be the most optimal way for ideal tanking or ideal DPS, so it's going to be more of like a fun cosmetic, fun cool thing to do in a TFO or a mission. It's definitely fun to do, but it's up to you as to whether you want to sink in that cost for that. They're still strong ships in their own right, so it's up to you as to whether the costs for getting a new Tier 6 starship from the new Infinity box or buying them off the exchange is worthwhile to you. But anyway, that's basically it for this video. It is kind of interesting that the cover picture that they had for this new announcement had these sticks front and center versus the other Voth ships. It's almost like they think that the Voth ships won't sell, which might be potentially true. There are a lot of ships that in many ways are better than those old ships nowadays, so it is kind of sad in many ways. I still love the Voth ships. A lot of my first characters use a lot of Voth ships to help survive throughout the game, along with the Kabbalite Samsar Cruiser, before I started getting a lot better at this game. So I do have a lot of nostalgia for these ships, and I hope that more people out there get to have some fun with them as well. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.